All right, welcome back. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am the co-founder and general partner of 8-Bit Capital, and I have this podcast, and you are listening to it. And thank you so much, and thank you so many of you now who listen to this. I appreciate it. My guest this week, Amy Nauiokas, and she's a venture capitalist. And I know you're thinking, if you listen to this podcast, hey, half of all venture capitalists are women. No, they're not. Half of all the people on this podcast are women, hopefully more if I get this thing right. But imagine for a second, we have a woman venture capitalist on, close your eyes and, don't close your eyes, I don't know, some kind of hippie all of a sudden. Imagine what this person's like. Like, what do you think in your mind when you think of a woman who's a venture capitalist? Okay, you got it? Now, did you imagine she started her career in the Peace Corps? Did you think that she also ran a movie and TV production company? Well, if not, here you go. My guest today, Amy Nauiokas. Welcome back. All right, welcome back. This is the Something Venture podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. I'm your host. My guest today is Amy Nauiokas. How are you doing?
Very well. Thank you so much for having me today, Kent.
Thanks so much for doing this, Amy. It's kind of hard. We've had women on who run venture capital firms, and Amy has started one and is the CEO of it. Anthemis Group, private equity venture focused on financial services. I'm guessing about $500 million under management, something like that.
A little north of that.
Okay, well, a lot of money under management, probably more than anyone we've talked to. And, as you would guess, is also founder and chair of a media production company that does finance and venture, a movie company, basically, Archer Gray. So, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Where are you in the world right now? But this sounds very New York to me.
Yeah, no, I'm on the East Coast. I'm in Connecticut, sort of in a little farm tucked away in Connecticut somewhere.
And were you in New York when the COVID came along and hit your two companies?
We were, and our offices are in Soho, and we made a decision pretty early on to kind of shut down the offices for everyone's safety, and people kind of went off to their various different hiding spots for the last 9 months or so. But and our offices are still closed, and we're all still remote and distributed. Though it wasn't really a huge jump for us because we were always distributed, and I have to think back to kind of, I don't know that we were necessarily prescient when we made this decision, but when my partner Sean and I started Anthemis, we were both living in London for like 2 days. And I was about to move back to New York, and he was about to move to Geneva. And we decided we wanted to start working together, but we didn't know each other very well.
Right.
But we knew that we sort of had something kind of aligned in our guiding principles and our thesis. And we sort of both admitted on that morning, like, I hate to tell you this, but I'm not going to be here anymore. And he was like, well, we'll make it work because I'm not going to be here either. And so he moved to Geneva, I moved to New York, and then we started our company in London. So being distributed is sort of part of our DNA, and it's worked really well for us.
It's very cool if you can make it work. I had a company before this that had offices in like Singapore, Uruguay, and Dublin. So sort of all points of the compass. And you definitely had it works fine. You definitely have some weird cultural issues with those places. And then just the time of day. So you'd have things where like it's one group of people, it's 8 a.m, so they're all, having their coffee and hanging out. And then one group of people is like ready to get the hell out of there because it's 7:30 at night in Singapore. So there's a couple things to manage, but you've obviously done it pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, I think as more and more of the world moves to sort of a more virtual, longer term environment, I think there will be some natural rules that emerge. I think there are going to be certain rules around, how do you define your world at any given moment, right? So it's a little harder, for example, to have somebody in Hawaii and somebody in Portugal, right? And not have somebody in New York and San Francisco and London. And I think that'll start to kind of evolve. But I'll tell you, it's been, for us, it was a big part of how we grew, right? This idea that we had an opportunity to be out of the sort of corridor of groupthink, in venture, which is a space where groupthink plays a big role and often plays a huge role in valuations and all the like. And so we were able to kind of keep ourselves on the outside, which meant we could think a little bit. We have our own thoughts. We can be unique in our own thoughts, but also when we floated into a company or we turned onto their radar, they were quite happy to talk to us, right? There was no question that if a company was willing to fly, 12 hours to see you, or be in a position where, they found you and they were there in London and you were in the Valley, like they couldn't figure out how did that happen. And so it gave us an edge, certainly above a lot of our competitors. And it's also allowed us to swim in a very different pond, I think, than a lot of the venture.
So you, an entrepreneur, you've built a venture capital firm, but first of all, you didn't go to Stanford or Harvard or Princeton, which are kind of the three places people seem to go. I went to Northwestern, which is like unheard of in Silicon Valley. There's a couple of people. And then you weren't here. You came out of investment banking. So not, the sort of traditional, I worked at Sequoia, then spun out. How did you get into banking? Were you like a liberal arts major? What were you doing? Like,
yeah, I was not only was a liberal arts major, I had always imagined my path would be through social service and public service. I spent a couple of years in the Peace Corps, and actually, when I came back, it was after sort of thinking that the difference that I could make would be better served if I had a platform and a network upon which to do the work that I felt very earnestly that I wanted to do. And I came from a very different socioeconomic class than a lot of my peers at school and certainly in the early days of Wall Street. And so I had to, by nature of, I guess, grit and to some degree perseverance, just prove myself every day, which I think you do when you sort of learn at, kind of jump up at Wall Street. But I was an outsider there. I was an outsider from the beginning. I've always been an outsider. And I think that really helped me stand apart. And I think there's been such a natural instinct in our world to homogenize all characters into sort of one size fits all, that it's really been to the disservice of the work that we do as entrepreneurs, as investors, as humans. And for me, it was my edge, right? It's that nobody knew what to do with me. And so every time I showed up and said, well, I have an idea, how about I do this? They were like, all right, what else are we going to do with you? And it kind of evolved from there. And that's how I got myself into tech, right? Was to sort of be at a place where when everybody else was focused on one thing inside of the banking world, I was looking to the left and saying, well, wait a minute, what about this thing that everybody else is paying attention to in other places, but not in financial services? And that's how the thesis evolved.
And you were in banking. This was the 90s in New York, right?
Yeah, the 90s in New York, and then the noughties and 90s in London and New York.
So this was the whole, well, I guess the ties were yellow in the 80s, but this was like this was like the 80-hour a week, and then if you were really good, you worked 95-hour a week, mostly men.
But I think people, you imagine this world of that kind of early 80s, and I actually those early 80s women, they are my goddesses and my pioneers, right? These are the women that went at it about 10 years before I did, with no body that looked like them in that sort of environment, right? It was not a very different world.
Yeah.
What happened in the 90s is that you had kind of the same environment. There still weren't that many, there were zero mentors, very few other women, but a lot of the stuff that was happening was starting to be shoved under the table under kind of, guise of good corporate governance or compliance or sexual harassment monitoring. But it was all still happening, right? And so in some ways, the 90s women were in a bit of a trickier position because everybody knew, if they open up their mouth, what's going to happen. And so a lot of what you did, or at least what I did in the early 90s, you kind of avoided even identifying as a woman in many ways. It was sort of like, I don't want people to know that I'm here, because I'm a woman, or despite the fact that I'm a woman. I want to do the good work. I want to put the hard work in. I want to be noticed for me. And it wasn't until, I first moved to London and took on a much more senior role where I had a significant number of employees reporting to me that I realized what a disservice I was doing to other women by staying in that space. And that's when my kind of eyes towards, being vocal about diversity and the importance of it in the workforce really took. Now, it was always something I believed in from the very beginning, the way I hired, the way I mentored, but I didn't have it as a badge of honor. And I think I got to a place where I was senior enough and comfortable enough in my own skin to start calling people on it.
Yeah, the 80s is really, I've had a number of women on, and kind of the more recent venture, Trey Vassallo and Maha Ibrahim, Ellen Pao certainly, who are, they've started, organizations like All Raise, et cetera. But when you talk to women going back to the Alpha Girls, they call themselves, like Teresa Gao, it was these women in venture capital in the 80s, and they were like kind of wearing khakis and trying to sort of just, fade out of anybody's attention, really. In some way, it's just a very different. I mean, they obviously laid the framework for the women who came later and, blew up some venture capital firms.
Don't forget, I mean, I think sometimes generationally we often forget how far we've come despite all the problems that still exist, right? Because it was also a time when we had hundreds of years of subjugation of the female gender and its place in our society. And so to then all of a sudden imagine, the first year or 2 years or 5 years that women are invited to join Wall Street or invited to join venture capital, that we should be ready to kind of rock everybody's world. And the unfortunate part is probably a lot of us were, but the world wasn't ready for us to do it, right? And that's, I think, the tricky balance between being a woman who wants to assert her own identity inside of these larger organizations that historically haven't had room for them.
Now, has Wall Street figured it? I mean, obviously, Silicon Valley, I've had this conversation many times, has not figured it out. But has Wall Street figured it out and become 50% women, or am I getting that wrong?
I know there was a stat at one point, certainly when I graduated from business school, I think there was something like, I think I was like one of 5% of my class, whereas I think the majority of the business schools now are about a 50-50 and from a gender perspective, which is great progress. That said, it's about what happens once you get into those jobs. And Wall Street, I think, has done a wonderful job in the last few years of identifying and appreciating that there might be more roles for women senior leadership than historically has been allowed to unfold. But without mentorship and without signals of other women who have made it or have done that, it's really hard to keep that really important sort of mid-career woman motivated in Wall Street firm. And I think that's the biggest opportunity, but it's also the biggest challenge, right? Is that you've got these women that despite what people will kind of stereotypically say, they leave because they've had babies. Most of the time, the women that are leaving in their sort of late 30s are leaving because they're done, right? They've learned just enough they've maybe made their own money. They've been exposed to a network where they're like, actually, I don't think I need to do this here. I'm out. And then they're going out and they're building companies or doing other things. And one of the impetuses behind our Female Innovators Lab at Anthemis was about how do we capture this opportunity and make sure these women who are the superstars of Wall Street don't disappear into some other industry. Like, let's keep them here and let's figure out how we can fuel them and help support the businesses as they grow.
So how did you come from being a hard-charging investment banker? The 90s happened, so I assume you're somewhat inspired by technology. But instead of going to a tech company, you literally started a venture capital firm. Like, how did you manage that and find a partner?
Well, I think a big part of my transition from kind of more traditional baby banking in the early to mid 90s into sort of more what would be considered today fintech, right, really evolved again from being sort of an outsider in an insider's world, right? Knowing that I was not interested in competing against, this person at this golf club or this, I just had some other view. And I had a lot of friends in the tech industry who were jumping ship and starting startups. And this was in the sort of early 2000s. And I kind of felt that there had to be a way inside the banks to see the same sort of change, but to do it from within. And so I kind of yielded into a career in what would be considered financial technology before it was cool, and certainly before it was a thing. Yeah. And so when just before the first crisis came around, it was this moment of having spent a good, at that point, almost 20 years pushing that proverbial elephant up the hill of how do I get these folks to see what I'm seeing? And I met my partner, Sean, and he was having this sort of same existential crisis. Like, I could spend the rest of my career trying to convince these guys that the sky is falling, only to be told, go away. We don't want to know. And we might, either we don't believe you, right, or we do believe you, but we only care for the next 2 years whether the sky falls. And so we're going to kind of not really pay attention to this. And then, and so when we met, it was a bit of a moment of kismet. He made the comment that I was like his Newman to his Seinfeld, right? He wondered why was it that I was able to, right? Every time he had a good idea, I would be right there executing it faster than him. And I just laughed and saying, you've been blogging for years. All I'm doing is paying attention to what you're saying, and I'm just executing it faster than you. And it was at that moment that we said, oh, wait, we might have something here, and let's build some core principles and a thesis that allows us to do this on our own. And that was what we built. And we never set out to build a traditional VC or in fact, a traditional asset manager, as much as we felt that there were problems that we could solve with a robust enough thesis that showcased how important financial services was to the entire world, not just the system. And in doing so, democratize finance in a way that allowed more people to access it, more people to participate in the financial markets, and more people to profit and experience from it. And that's really what the core Anthemis thesis has been built on. And who we did it with is I think what's kept us really on the cutting edge.
Who did you do it with?
Well, we did it. I think we did it as part of our core. We weren't going to build the firm that we'd come from, and we weren't going to build anything that looked anything like traditional tech or traditional private equity. And so we started, bringing together a group of very eclectic and different and diverse background people to sort of form this platform. And now we're 50 people around the world, and we're working out of 3 physical offices and probably about 10 virtual offices. And we're north of 50% female. 65% of the decision makers at the firm are women. We have, I think, about 40% BIPOC and BAME background, 12% LGBTQ, 25% of our portfolio is women, 20% of our portfolio is Black or people of color. And so, again, I think because many of whom have never worked in financial services, right? So that's another part of how we look at diversity. People with physical challenges, emotional challenges, and bringing them together in this kind of hodgepodge of creativity to kind of figure out how to make some impact on the financial system.
So how did you guys build that? Did you set out to find a certain type of person, or said we actually don't care what the type of person is, and that's just what you ended up with?
Yeah, it was certainly deliberate and by design, but it wasn't that we were looking for a certain type of character. And that character needed to be, have a lot of grit. They needed to be able to work very carefully and thoughtfully in an environment with a lot of ambiguity, right? We were asking them to come on to a platform that was distributed before anybody was doing distributed, that was diverse before anybody was doing diverse, that was actually fighting the good cause because we were looking at ESG and investing for good before anybody was calling it ESG. So we had all these sort of things that made it more difficult as Anthemis went forward, but also that we felt so deeply about that it became a bit of a magnet for some of those folks. And quite frankly, and I say this to founders all the time, it doesn't take much, right? Your first 2-3 hires will start to seed everything. And for us, we're early stage investors. So, when people say to me, oh, why don't you just invest in women or just invest in Black people? I say, no, I actually do better personally with 2 white men, because if they're the only 2 employees, I have a lot of shape that I can help bring to that company if they're committed to this. And the first 2, 3, 4, 5 employees that they hire with me as a governor on their board is maybe really, creating a much different version of that company than would have happened had I not been there.
So what is going on in that billions of dollars? I just talked to somebody who's a Black guy who figured out the statistics of how much money has gone into companies in the past couple quarters, and the percent that went to, in his case, was, people of color, it's just insanely low. Is that the same for women in the financial services? Like, as you invest, is it, 90% goes to the 2 white guys starting the thing?
90 would be generous, assuming we got 10% of the rest. There's lots of data pre-COVID that points to a small uptick in funding for women founders, which was good news, is good news. And a lot of female-founded startups have raised venture capital in the last couple of years. That said, and this is really sort of depressing, given everything that's going on in our world and everything that we're hopeful about, we've seen some lows, right? That the VC firms invested a total of $434 million, which how big the VC community is. $434 million ain't much, right? And that was Q3 to female founders. So the numbers are the lowest figures since the second quarter of 2017. And that is, debilitating kind of on a macro level, but there are some moments of absolute joy on a micro level because we're not having any problems at all. And I think my biggest request or demand from the market generally is, if you're going to do this, do it authentically. Stop the virtue signaling. I don't care if it's women, if it's BIPOC, I don't care if it's LGBTQ. You have to be authentic in how you're identifying a problem to close the funding gap and what you're doing to do it. And to remember that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, right? That there's no solution for women that will be the same for Black founders. And there's no solution for LGBTQ founders that will be the same for BAME founders. And yeah, there might be, with intersectionality, a crossover from time to time, but every single one of these communities and intersected communities are so nuanced with challenges, none of which should be tackled with a blanket approach, right? For female founders, for example, we were solving a problem about increasing the pipeline, encouraging women to get off the sidelines, giving them the capital, the portfolio company support, the mentorship to get in there and build great companies. Our approach for Black founders, very, very different, right? We're challenging we're tackling the challenges in the BIPOC community by helping give access to angel networks, right? This is the first pre-seed check, looking to fund the angels or the potential angels in the community that can then fund the companies, right? Because that's the problem. And on and on, you can identify problems across the system that are unique, and doing it right demands that level of thoughtfulness, and it demands listening and learning from the different communities that you're trying to serve and support. And the only way that happens is through representation in your own team, right? Because if you don't have anybody to talk to about it or to ask, gee, what's happening here? You can't possibly understand authentically what collaboration and support of those communities looks like.
So what is the upstream or downstream, upstream aspect that needs to be solved? In that, I've talked to African-American venture capitalists who point out that if you're a Black guy and you come up through whatever, even you manage to get into Harvard, and then Goldman Sachs comes along and says, hey, we're going to pay you $600,000 a year, you've been through some life experiences and you kind of say, yeah, I'm going to take that $600,000 a year. Whereas if you're Mark Zuckerberg and you've just been rich, and you're like, I'm going to start a company. No, what could go wrong? That they're not failing to be entrepreneurs. They're not making irrational decisions. They're just following a path.
Yeah, and listen, I know the journey from my own perspective socioeconomically, because I didn't start this journey with a net, right? I went to Wall Street to create a net that then I can use to do something else, and that story isn't unique, but it was my story, and I think that what I think about when I think about how we change that, right, is part of it is these angel checks, right? Getting money in the hands of people who can give that first check. Changing the requirements about, if you're starting a venture capital fund, your LP commitment. Does it really matter?
Yeah.
If what's really the whole point? LPs want to see a general partner commit what is a meaningful amount of capital or resource to the fund to know that they're vested.
Yeah.
I don't know many people that start their own VC fund, myself included, that even if you put $1 in it, you have to be fully vested, right?
Yeah, I think it's ridiculous. We come across this in our fund where like they're like, oh, this other guy put 10% of the fund in. You're like, yeah, he's worth $500 million. He put in $10 million, which means literally nothing. And by the way, that guy's probably not going to be a VC in 2 years because he's so rich. Yeah. And if you're a young guy starting out, you're like, my whole world is this company. Like, I'm not I need to make this VC firm succeed.
Well, and that's, it's so interesting that you say that, because what's missing in the LP GP funding community, and I've experienced it personally, and I know a lot of my peers have as well, is that it isn't personal. Right? It isn't. You don't take a meeting with a large institutional investor or a large corporate pension fund and say, "Hey, Amy, I want to learn more about you. Tell me who you are, what motivates you, and why you're here." And if you get asked that question, you better hope that the answer is in service of your financial return and only your financial return, because a lot of them don't really care. Right. And I think for us, we've almost tripped ourselves up sometimes because we are so authentic and transparent in what we say. So you ask me a question about what drives me, and if I talk about all my kids, I don't want to then be dinged because I don't have enough time to spend
Right.
managing money because she has too many kids, right? Like,
Right.
so it's sort of like, it's a bit of a game. And I think we need to all demand that game starts to dissipate if we're going to truly enact some of these goals around diversity. And I think that the folks that are standing up, the Yales and the other endowments are standing up and saying, we really mean this.
Yeah.
It's not about meaning it, it's about meaningfully doing it.
Right.
And that takes a little bit more time than just saying, here's the allocation, go find some Black founders, go find some women.
And what do you make of the sort of Silicon Valley hegemony, like where, there's Stanford, and then because there's Stanford, there's Sequoia, because there's Sequoia, there's Airbnb, because there's, the cycle.
I think it's been fascinating to watch a little of that start to kind of peel away and panic, really, in the midst of COVID, right? Because that sort of little secret bubble that has always existed in the Valley, which no one really questioned, or maybe people questioned it, but they didn't really, go, it's like the great and wonderful Oz. They didn't pull back the curtain and sort of see, well, what's really behind it? And what you're realizing is it's a lot of the same people with the same backgrounds, with the same capital base, sitting in the same office on Sand Hill Road, which ironically isn't even in San Francisco. And what a lot of, Valley entrepreneurs forget, or non-Valley entrepreneurs forget, is that a lot of these guys aren't leaving their desks, let alone, going to Oakland to meet a company, or going to the city proper to meet a company. So historically for us, it was a great edge because we could just fly in and be like, oh, hey, we've come from London, or we've come from New York. And they're like, oh, well, I'll spend 2 hours with you. And you can get to know a company a lot better if you spend 2 hours with them than if you spend 5 minutes, right? But now this sort of world where we all have access and we all have the ability to hire great people, to fund great companies. They don't have to sit in some magic corridor, right? They can be anywhere.
Yep.
I think it's going to really start to change the fabric. It's going to take time, but I'm really optimistic. I think, and quite frankly, even the I call it the democratization effect of Zoom, right? I think what people are forgetting is that when you show up at your little Zoom square, you don't get to choose where you sit, right? You don't get to take the head of the table or the center square. You get popped up wherever you get, and you're in a different perspective and a different viewpoint, and you're kind of equalized across your Zoom colleagues. And then the other magic thing about Zoom is that voice modulation, right? That no one gets to be louder necessarily.
Yeah.
And so you don't see a lot of, you still hear the talking over, but like, it's so obvious when someone talks over somebody now that it's like, oh, sorry, oh, you go, and it's really, I think I've seen it lifts some voices up that we haven't heard from before. And that's how you build perspective and you change things.
Is this true? Because obviously, I'm a VC in Silicon Valley, so the bubble works for me. Now, I try to have a podcast where I talk to women and people of color because I get the joke that everybody and I've mentioned this a couple of times, that when people are on a podcast talking about their venture career, and venture is a lovely job. There's very few of those jobs in the world. They pay very well. They're lovely. And they'll say, hey, how'd you become a venture capitalist? And the answer is, I fell into it. Well, and they fell into it because they went to Stanford and their roommate's dad founded whatever. They never said, oh, I was in the projects in Chicago and I fell into it. Yeah. So I do get the joke for sure.
Well, and that's why I think we have a responsibility as venture capital platforms to make the right decisions in hiring. Because the thing I've always loved about venture is it is democratizing in the sense that it does not require, just because you went to Columbia or Stanford does not mean you're going to have a better shot at picking the next unicorn company.
Well, for sure.
Right? In fact, I'd argue you might have less of a better shot, right? Because you don't have the same entrepreneurial and risk-taking mindset that allows you to sort of see the stuff people aren't seeing. I think the amount of diversity we've created inside of our portfolio of 100 plus companies in large part comes because we have people swimming in ponds that no one else is swimming in, right? Yeah. So we're able to get that trade. So we're not competing with a lot of people, right? We have great co-investment relationships, and every now and then we'll lose a deal to this person or that person. But for the most part, our pool is a bit wider than I think what most people are. And that's why I feel like we have a responsibility to hire appropriately, right? You're not looking for just the sort of latest batch of business school grads, right? You kind of can take a chance on somebody who seems to really, have that sort of
Well, and I think the global thing breaks open too. It's always been like Singapore is a good example. There's never a venture ecosystem in Singapore, and the reason was that there'd never been like $100 million exit. And so no VC, as egotistical as they are, believed they were going to be the guy with the first $100 million exit. And then there was 100 million, then Vicky got bought for $250 million. Well, now there's nothing but venture capital available in Singapore. And so I think any place in the world, as soon as they have a success, a unicorn, the Nordics have had a ton of them, then the capital, I had Brad Feld on talking about this, how he doesn't think every city, like he doesn't think Des Moines, Iowa is necessarily going to be a hub, but he thinks the top 1,000 cities could be places where, where
Yeah.
unicorns will come from.
I think that's absolutely right. And I'd argue that you could even push it even further to suggest that even outside of the cities, right? Because there's now a forced challenge or forced opportunity where people might make choices to live in places that aren't as expensive, which then takes away the stress of their own situation, which then maybe provides them with a little bit more risk appetite to do something that they've always wanted to do with a different security net that they didn't have because they felt the only job they could get was sitting in the middle of New York City or in the middle of the valley. And I think that helps them imagine a world where you do see some real gems.
I think the kind of post-COVID vaccine world will be really interesting. I'm just intrigued by firms like Bear Stearns or the big investment banks, because when it's the case that some people can come back, I just wonder what that's going to be like. Like someone will come back and they'll be in New York at her desk, and Johnny will be zooming in from Reno.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't know what that's like looks like at an investment bank.
We have a practice at Anthemis of sort of calling, safe to try experiments. And so this experience has given us a ton of opportunities to try a few experiments. And the one that we're sort of playing with right now is around remote first, right? And just seeing what that feels like. If we opened up an office here and people felt they needed to be there, and by the way, a lot of people do need to be in the office, right? Not everybody has a full bedroom to work in.
Oh yeah.
Or childcare to be able to support them. And I think that that what we're hopeful on is that some of the, it's challenging, right? I mean, I'm a person that quite likes to be with people and to sort of feed off their energy and to sort of have to do all of that work virtually. But the remote first model, I think, could be really interesting as sort of time goes on, because it is more democratizing, and it also cuts out the thing that I've never liked. We don't have a lot of it at Anthemis, but a lot of companies do, this sort of FaceTime that you feel like you can, politic somebody because you're physically there and you're going to be, staying late and coming in early. And I think it's kind of the least attractive thing about corporate America.
That is the problem with the half and half office, because the person in the office is going out to a beer with the boss. And
yes and no, right? If that's part of and it's also around leadership's decisions too. It's like I have to make a conscious decision not to always show up to the office, because if I do, then people will think that's where we're supposed to be. And I think for us, it's easy because we're distributed. And quite frankly, I don't think people care where I am. Going up, I think it's more likely if I show up, then nobody will go out for a beer, right? That's unfortunate. But I think that I do think that there are a lot of organizations, some of the big law firms, the big banks, where it's still so hierarchical that if the leadership teams don't make a concerted effort to make a change, nothing's going to change in those communities.
That's right. That's a better way of saying what I was trying to get to. Let me wrap up. But I just quickly want to ask you, you then start a firm, Archer Gray, which is like a movie company on the side. Well, first of all, why is it called Archer Gray? That's not your name.
No, that's my two sons' names.
Oh, that is very cool. And by the way, that's just a cool name. It just sounds cool. Like I would make a movie with Archer Gray.
I know, and I love it because every time a movie comes out, they get so excited to go and look at the movie poster. They don't even care about the movie; they just want to see the poster.
See your name.
Yeah.
That's the whole thing. You haven't made a movie until you have a poster.
That's right.
How did you start with Broadway, or you started with movies, or like?
So I started simultaneously with developing and funding Broadway and film projects, and just really on a lark, a desire to kind of play with my creative brain as I was starting to build Anthemis, and also wanting to test a thesis I had around the sort of intersectionality of what was happening in the industries vis-a-vis financial services, right? That ultimately all companies become financial services companies if
Right.
they can, if you're talking about transacting in space and time and financing and lending, et cetera. And so I felt the only way to really properly learn a new industry was to go in from the part of the industry that was driving the industry, so the content piece. And I guess I just didn't expect to fall in love with it, right? I was doing it kind of on my own with,
Yeah.
with a couple of projects here and some partners here. And then had the wonderful luck and privilege to meet my producing partner, Ann Carey. And once I met Ann, and we recognized how much similarity we had in the types of things we wanted to make and wanted to build, I kind of leaned in and created Archer Gray around that.
And do you do mostly what do you do? Broadway movies?
Now we do in large part films and theatrical, which is sort of a question right now of what
Right.
theatrical looks like, and a long form series and television. From time to time, we'll look at a project on in theater, but it's mostly around film and television.
What does theatrical? I was just realizing this. I went to Hamilton in San Francisco on like March 6th. And I think people were kind of wearing masks. And then March 10th, it was over in California. Like everything. I was like, wow, I saw one of the last productions of Hamilton. Like,
people are the industry is having to get very creative. But I honestly, I think in very similar ways as we've seen the, digitization of financial services evolve quickly in this particular pandemic, you're seeing this move towards a new model for media consumption that was already well on its way, right? The
Right.
streamers were already playing such a huge role in driving consumption patterns of individuals around various different pieces of content, and that's not going away. I think what will change is sort of the live entertainment piece and how we have to rethink how that plays out. We just started a new business at Archer Gray around it's our collab business about working with talent and brands to try to help understand and appreciate what that means in the new world. And that's sort of I think how we'll repurpose our theatrical and our live entertainment space. But there's lots of changes to come, and I think there's going to be some really very cool things that come from it. But I think it's also going to be really sad too to see some of the stuff that gets lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, I really miss the live shows. So what can you do? So let me kind of finish with it. Like, what is your thought for people in Silicon Valley? Like, one of the things I do in this podcast is I start out playing the fool and talking to women and people of color about because if you're a white guy in Silicon Valley and you're not harassing anybody, you're not being harassed. It's not that you don't think there's problems. You just don't think about it often. It just doesn't come to your mind.
Yeah.
What should people like? What should we do? Like, what should a white guy in Silicon Valley do or think about to be helpful, so we don't have this all Stanford, all Princeton, all white guy world?
Shut up, listen, and make some space. I honestly think that's for as much as you don't think about it, imagine that anybody that isn't you is thinking about it all the time. Every single part of every single day. I think about my identity and what it means to my existence. And if I were a Black woman, that would be more than every single part of every single day, right? And I think we have a responsibility as allies to any community to take the time to be quiet and to listen and see what we might be able to learn in that very quiet moment when we let other voices be heard.
That's great. Thank you. So how do people find you or follow you, or if you're not, people all over the planet listen to this podcast, and many of them are frustrated entrepreneurs who wish everything wasn't Silicon Valley. How do people track you or Anthemis down?
I think the best place to find us is to just go to our website. Yeah, our best place to find us is to go to our website. We've got a ton of insightful papers. One just recently that launched our diversity series on the female funding gap, and I think it's a provocative way of looking at women in finance. Anthemis.com.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for doing this.
All right, thank you so much, Ken, for having me. It's a pleasure.
All right, my guest has been Amy Nauiokas with Something About Your Podcast. I'll talk to you next time.